Good evening and welcome to the 2021 Walton Lecture on Science and Religion. My name is Peter van der Burgt and I'm chairing the Committee of Christians in Science Ireland, which is organizing the Walton Lectures. We're a local group of Christians in science based in the United Kingdom and Ireland. On your screen beside me is Professor Stephen Williams, who will give the 2021 Walton Lecture shortly. Professor Williams will be answering questions after this lecture. If you want to ask a question, please put it into the chat in Facebook or in YouTube, and I will mediate the questions and ask them to Professor Williams. Before I introduce Professor Williams, I want to say a few words about the Walton Lectures. These lectures are named after Ernest Walton, who was Professor of Physics at Trinity College Dublin. Ernest Walton shared the 1951 Nobel Prize in Physics with John Crofton for the nuclear physics experiments they did at the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge University. Walton was a long-time member of the Methodist Church, and following the award of the Nobel Prize, he spoke on science and religion at various locations. At this point, we want to acknowledge Marion and Derek Woods in Belfast. Marion is Walton's daughter, and on behalf of the Walton family, she has agreed that we could use Walton's names for these lectures. We're delighted that Professor Stephen Williams has agreed to give the 2021 Walton Lecture on the topic of artificial intelligence. Given the increasing importance of thinking machines in many of the devices that we use on a daily basis, it is quite timely to get a Christian perspective on the question of whether machines can think and what is meant by consciousness and intelligence. Stephen Williams is Professor Emeritus in Systematic Theology at Union Theological College in Belfast. He received his PhD from the Department of Religious Studies at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. Before coming to Belfast, he worked in Oxford at the Whitefield Institute for Theological Research, and he was Professor of Theology at United Theological College in Aberystwyth in Wales. In 2017, Professor Williams was appointed Honorary Professor of Theology at Queen's University in Belfast. During 2018, he held a research fellowship at the Henry Center at the Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield in Illinois, researching the connection between transhumanism and a Christian understanding of creation. He is published in different areas, especially in theology and intellectual history, and his latest book, which is edited with John Wyatt and published by SPCK in London, is The Robot Will See You Now, Artificial Intelligence and the Christian Faith. The title of Professor Williams' lecture tonight is Thinking Machines, a Christian Perspective.
Well, Peter, thank you for your welcome and for your introduction and for the invitation. Thanks to the committee, the invitation to give this lecture. My formation is in the humanities, so you're taking a bit of a risk here, and I hope you don't regret it. And selfish as I am, I hope even more that I don't regret it. But thanks very much. I look forward to this session with you. Thinking Machines, a Christian Perspective. The title seems to depict not only two worlds apart, but also two worlds apart twice over. Firstly, Christianity is culturally marginal in much of the West. Where it is not, it standardly pops up wearing the shabby cloak of fundamentalism, which doesn't seem exactly decked out for intellectual engagement with AI. Secondly, even if we bridge the worlds of Christianity in general and thinking machines in general, what on earth can Christians sensibly say on the subject of thinking, where machines are concerned? If they want to say something about the social and cultural significance of AI, well, let them go ahead. The public square in a self-respecting democracy is open to a plurality of voices. But if our ambition is to comment from a Christian point of view on the possibility of machines being able to think, how can Christianity possibly have something to say about the scientific or technical possibility of machine thought, more than it would have something to say about quadratic equations, the chemical behavior of calcium carbonate, or electricity? Those acquainted with Alan Turing's endlessly referred to paper on computing machinery and intelligence in 1950, the one that introduced to the public the Turing test, will suggest an answer. Turing described and responded to 9 objections to the claim that machines might be able to think. And the first of these was theological. The objection goes like this: the organ of thought is the soul, to which the brain is instrumental. Machines lack a soul, therefore machines lack the capacity for thought. Turing tells us that he doesn't think much of theology in general, but he may as well point out that this objection fails. Why? Because theologians believe that God is omnipotent. Thus, God could bestow a soul on an elephant if he so wished, concomitantly conferring on the elephant an appropriately improved brain to minister to the needs of the soul in the course of a mutation. If so, then there should be no difficulty in principle in a divine extension of this capacity to machines, imparting to them a soul, thus enabling their cranial equipment to think. Turing's argument does not directly concern me here. All I'm doing is noting the reason which he gives for why there might be such a thing as a Christian perspective on the possibility of thinking machines. But does this belief in the soul have any traction today? Has it not been discredited, not just outside, but within Christianity, with a number of theologians insisting that the kind of separation between soul and body which underlies the position which Turing treats is neither true to Scripture nor the stuff of sound theological reasoning? If the soul's detractors are right, we are back where we started, wondering what Christianity has to say to the possibility of thinking machines. Perhaps best start somewhere else and try to get clear on what leading figures in the world of AI say about it. Of course, they say different things. But let me pick out an influential account found in the dominating textbook in the field of AI, by all accounts several country miles ahead of anything else, published just this year in its 4th edition. Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig's Artificial Intelligence, a Modern Approach. It runs to over 1,000 pages. By the way, my answer is no, but I hope to. The question, can machines really think, is raised only at its conclusion, constituting a subsection of less than 2 pages to a discussion on philosophy, ethics, and safety of AI. The authors do not speak for everyone in the field, but it is instructive to note how they answer their question, because their answer is in line with what many in the AI community will say. They quote the computer scientist Edgar Dijkstra. I may be mispronouncing that word. This is the quotation. The question of whether machines can think is about as relevant as the question of whether submarines can swim. Relevance here is apparently relevance to design. Aircraft are brought into the equation to make the point. Aircraft design is unaffected by the question of whether they can strictly fly, if adjudication on this matter is placed in the hands or claws of our feathered friends. But the fact is that it makes obvious sense to speak of them as flying. Norvig and Russell approve of Alan Turing's position that continual arguing over the question of whether machines think, in some fully adumbrated philosophical sense of thinking, is rather futile. They cite Alexander and Burnett. Rather than becoming embroiled in the controversies which surround the nature of human intelligence, the practitioners of AI have generally chosen to define their goals in empirical or operational terms, rather than theoretical ones. An intelligent machine, they suggest, is one that is able to do things which, if done by people, would be judged to require intelligence. A parallel line can be taken on the question of machines thinking. According to Norvig and Russell, if a machine behaves intelligently, we should ascribe to it the capacity to think as an extension of the polite convention which we adopt in relation to other human beings who behave intelligently. We have no direct access to others' mental states, but the entirely reasonable thing to do is to affirm that they, like us, can and do think. So with machines. The authors add that intelligence surely entails awareness, and awareness is an aspect of consciousness. I won't go into the distinction here between awareness and consciousness. Consciousness is a scientific mystery for us at present, they say, but it is a reasonable presumption that this nexus of features, intelligence, thinking, awareness, consciousness, hang together in AI. Norvig and Russell do not want to attribute to machines baldly, straightforwardly, studiously, or simplistically the capacity to think. But for all practical purposes, we must regard them as having that capacity. By any standards, both here and elsewhere, Norvig and Russell make some huge leaps. And there are people in the field of AI who most certainly would say so. But rule number one for the outsider is to be prepared for the use of language in books written by practitioners in the field of AI, which differs from that obtaining in some other fields. So we have to be careful about what thinking means across different disciplines. As an instructive example, take the vocabulary of agency. In philosophical or theological discourse, I guess we should normally ascribe agency, if not just to human beings, at least just to sentient beings. But Russell and Norvig describe an agent as something that acts. Wolfgang Oertel, who wrote an introduction to AI because Norvig and Russell was too long and expensive for many students, Oertel remarks that agent denotes rather generally a system that processes information and produces an output from an input. Max Tegmark, professor of physics at MIT, notes that computer scientists will refer to entities that collect information about their environment from sensors and then process this information to decide how to act back in their environment. They'll refer to those as intelligent agents. This is pretty standard stuff for those of you who are involved in computer science. I pick out agency not as a random example of words to watch when shifting from one discipline to another in discussing AI, but because the language of agency exemplifies the way object and person may be bracketed together in AI literature, and this alerts us to what is going on with machines that think. What Norvig and Russell say about rational and intelligent agency in a discussion which follows the introductory chapter actually steers the subsequent parts of the volume. They deploy what they call a standard model of rational agency. Quote, a rational agent is one that acts so as to achieve the best outcome, or where there is uncertainty, the best expected outcome. AI has focused on the study and construction of agents that do the right thing, and what counts as the right thing is defined by the objective that we provide to the agent. Accordingly, in the following chapter on intelligent agents, humans are treated as a species of the genus rational agents. The most prominent examples of rational agents powdering this chapter are enhanced vacuum cleaners and autonomous taxis. Now, for moral philosophers and theologians, the phrase doing the right thing usually refers to human moral action. Fine, say Norvig and Russell, humans and vacuum cleaners both share rational agency, and moral agency is a form of rational agency which is applicable just to humans, but not to vacuum cleaners. I shall leave Norvig and Russell and the AI literature there. I repeat, they do not speak for the whole AI community. I also repeat that if they were either idiosyncratic or marginal, I should not be citing them. This is what students at a great number of educational institutions, schools, institutes of higher education, colleges, universities, are reading. The position which I have described goes roughly, look, AI is rational in our terms. That is, terms of computer science, of which AI is a subdiscipline or subfield. They are intelligent in our terms. AI thinks in our terms, and our terms are perfectly sensible, to say the least, and impeccably rational. Okay, now what Christian perspective can be brought to bear on the matter of thinking machines? I shall not try to handle the question of the soul in Christian theology. Generally, and perhaps even universally, the biblical word for soul, whether in Hebrew or in Greek, does not pick out a disembodied entity capable of disembodied existence. If we take our lead from the Hebrew vocabulary in the Old Testament, soul could be described as the vital, animating principle of body, the life principle, its life principle, not necessarily in distinction to the solid, corporeal, material body which we all have, but that which makes our bodies living bodies rather than stones, for example. Animals are ensouled, living beings in that sense. But how useful is it to consult biblical terminology when addressing the contemporary question of thinking machines? Is it not an exercise in archaic futility? Whatever the Bible has to say about the soul, does it not speak of the heart as the organ of thought? The brain is not found there. On the other hand, heart, along with kidneys, liver, bowels, head, etc., all feature in biblical anatomy. If we treat the vocabulary of biblical anthropology in terms of primitive science, the problem with bringing Scripture into dialogue with modern science is not that biblical language is scientifically imprecise. On the contrary, the problem is that biblical language is scientifically precise, and it is precisely wrong. Witness talk of heart and absence of brain. But all that is the case if we read the Bible in the light of modern science, treating it as a primitive science rather than on its own terms. When we treat it on its own terms, scientific precision is exactly what we do not find in the Bible. What do I mean? Well, different biblical translations give us a clue. You will sometimes find alternative translations of one and the same Hebrew word as heart or mind. This is not just an English choice. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, standardly used as the Bible in the early church, does the same thing. When I pick up my NIV to read Psalm 73:21, I read that my heart was grieved and my spirit embittered. But the word here translated spirit is kidneys in the Hebrew. The usual Hebrew word for spirit is a different one. And if you graduate from the NIV to the ESV, you will read that it was your soul rather than your spirit which was embittered. Now, we might conclude that it's just as well the biblical writers, except Luke, or at least its translators, were not called on to perform surgical operations on heart or kidneys. But we should certainly pause before concluding that. For we could multiply examples. Our friend the soul is a word that can just be translated the self in some contexts. Indeed, the word standardly used for soul can also be translated throat in a given case. The fact is that intellectual and emotional functions of the human being are not rigidly anatomically assigned in Scripture, nor do they need to be in order for the biblical writers to get their message across. Gordon McConville, from whom I have lifted all these examples, rightly takes them to illustrate that the Hebrew writers were working with a kind of unitary understanding of the human that modern readers may not immediately recognize. Those are his words. Terms in the original language, not in translations, exercise some liberty when it comes to scientific anthropology. And anatomical terms in the Bible are not simply used of individuals. The people has a heart, just as the people has a memory bank. Israel is to love God with its heart, soul, and strength. Old Testament writers plunder their lexical stock to convey something other than scientific ideas whatever scientific ideas go into the mix. When we come to the New Testament, the authors are not about to tighten up anthropological vocabulary in a scientific way. Let's confine ourselves for a moment to the most prolific of them, Paul, though Luke wrote more words. In 1 Thessalonians 5:23, Paul prays that his readers' spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless, a formulation unparalleled not only in Paul, but also in the rest of the New Testament. Commentators on it usually point out that it is virtually, if not absolutely impossible to distinguish between soul and spirit in Pauline usage elsewhere. And that Paul deploys anthropological terminology in an ad hoc fashion. He can use popular language, liturgical language, or language adapted to his particular audience. He can contrast body with spirit or mind with flesh with terminological freedom. And to move away from Paul, no early biblical reader would have become scientifically curious when Jesus added the word mind to his quotation from Deuteronomy, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength." And mind, says Jesus. So what is my point? I want to remove an objection to the attempt to apply biblical anthropology to the question of thinking in a contemporary scientific context. Biblical writers do not rivet their theological anthropology to scientific anatomy. If I were to say in this lecture today that the heart pumps blood, and in some lecture tomorrow that the brain pumps blood, you would gently suggest to me that a little consistency and accuracy might do no harm to my street cred. But suppose I responded, who cares as long as the blood circulates? Well, far be it from me to guess what goes on behind the closed doors of the smoke-filled room of the committee that appoints the Walton lecturer. But I doubt if I should discover there an agenda item proposing me as the annual Walton lecturer for Christians in Science over the next 10 years. I know the perils which attend a thought experiment such as the following, but let me venture it anyway. Imagine you sidle up to a biblical writer and say, "Inspired friend, you need to be better informed about what comes out of the heart and what comes out of the brain, of which you seem to be lamentably ignorant." Then you proceed to offer anatomical instruction. He, assuming that all the biblical writers were male, will respond, well, would you believe it? I'll be a blue-nosed gopher. Most interesting, my learned, if not exactly inspired modern friend. Thank you. But it makes not a whit of difference to anything I want to say. My thoughts and desires come from somewhere in me, in my body itself. That's how I experience it. Now let's talk about what I really want to talk about, good and bad desires, right and wrong thoughts. And let me ask you to give me an account what goes on in that brain of yours when it whirs around thinking, if that's what happens, or whirs around in some sort of connection with your thinking, if that's what you were saying. You've told me all about the mechanics of thought. Let me tell you a little about the disposition of heart or mind, and about openness and a truthful relationship to God, and how you need to let your brain whir or chatter away, or whatever it does, to that end. Just as biblical language, and ours for that matter, about the sun moving and rising is observation or experiential, and not scientific language, so it is with the language of biblical anthropology. It is characteristically observational or experiential language, as it is with us when we talk about our hearts leaping or a cold hand clutching our heart. I'm not saying that primitive science is absent from biblical, cosmological, or anthropological discourse. But what the biblical writers want to put across is this, and it is of permanent theological importance, whatever their notions were about bodily processes involved in thinking. They wanted to say humans are essentially religious beings whose rational faculties and moral agency are designed by the Creator within and only within the bounds of their religious constitution. That is an abstract way of saying that humankind is made in the image of God, not as some generically religious kind of being, but as specifically related to the one true and living God in a way that comes to clearest light in Jesus Christ. Created, humankind is to exercise its faculties in proper dominion over the earth. Fallen, it is to exercise its spirit in repentance and faith. Created and fallen, it is to exercise its energies in the love of God and neighbor. Humankind is constituted as an entity for this end. The brain has been so devised by its Creator that when it functions properly, it is directed to those ends, whatever it is up to in its proximate daily operations. Basically, the brain is constituted as a religious organ, in the sense that when it functions properly, it is directed, the brain is constituted as a religious organ in the sense that its bodily function is located within a being made in the image of God. If science instructs us that desiring, loving, and thinking have anything at all to do with the brain, then theology instructs us that desire must be healed and redirected, love renewed and empowered, and thinking adjusted to those ends, so that brain activity in its daily and living dynamic is also suitably conformed to the love of God and neighbor. Now, what bearing does this have on the question of whether machines can think? After all, I have been touching on the grand overarching purpose of human thought and the instrumentality of the human brain in that context and to that end, not on the mechanics of the brain's operation. I have been talking in unscientific, teleological terms, terms of ultimate purpose, not in causal scientific terms, terms of physical operation. If science or neuroscience ever uses teleological language, the language of purpose, it is with reference to the kind of immanent material processes which science investigates and describes. I, on the other hand, have brought into the equation something different, talk of a transcendent purpose, which belongs to a different and entirely distinct domain from the scientific. So irrespective of whether my Christian beliefs are right or wrong, how does talk of transcendent purpose for humankind tell us anything about the physical operations of the brain and enable us to contribute anything to the question of whether machines can think? Well, Christianity is not deism. I use deism in its popular sense to mean the belief that God created the world and everything in it, setting up the natural order, but having no further contact with it. Christianity believes that the human brain is constituted by its Creator, not only so that it is generically religious, in the sense I've described, but also so that there can be direct communication between God and each particular person. God addresses and is addressed by distinct individuals, not mere tokens of generic humankind, when they are in thought or prayer or in any other situation, nor is humankind an aggregate of individuals. Individual humans are brought to their fulfillment in the corporate body of the church, itself also addressed by and addressing God in thought or prayer and worship in historically particular, unrepeatable spaces and times. Pivotal in the human being whose destiny is communion with God through Christ and the church, the brain is crafted for this end and wired to attain it. The Greek word for church is ecclesia, so Christianity holds that the evolved human brain is ecclesially wired. And let me make an aside here which touches on something which deserves thorough independent treatment. I can't give it here, but I've yet to research this, but I'm aware of the claims of interpersonal neurobiology, claims within the domain of neuroscience, with a rigorous scientific insistence that the brain is wired to interpersonal connection and concord, From a neurobiological point of view, talk of ecclesial wiring adumbrates the nature of human interconnection that is scientifically demonstrable. That is, the interconnection is demonstrable, not the ecclesial bit. Now, all this has clear implications, surely, for the way we think about AI in general and thinking machines in particular. Nothing is or can be greater than God. Nothing is or can be greater than for humankind or for any created entity whatsoever than knowing God in the dynamic of relationship. Any created intelligence that does not pivot on this reality is both different in kind from human intelligence, and if we have some reason to use the comparative language of superior and inferior, it is vastly inferior. Let me comment on these two things, different intelligence and inferior intelligence. Firstly, difference. If human thought can proceed atheistically, reckoning without God, it has that power and possibility only because the human brain is positively organized by its creator so that it has religious power and possibility. I merely apply here a Christian perspective on evil and created good. Evil is not created by God. It is the perversion of the good, the exercise of created powers to an end other than a created end. A simple example, I can use my hand to strike and wound. I can do so only because my hand has the power to comfort and help. The mechanism and power of the hand is all the same, whether it harms or comforts. But if it is intended by God for comfort and help, the power which enables it to achieve that end also enables it to achieve its opposite, a harmful end. So it is with the brain. The brain can go about its business with no reference whatsoever to God, only because it is empowered to operate at all as a human brain, the brain of a human being destined to glorify God. Of course, there is talk of religious AI. If a robotic priest thinks, he or she thinks to a religious end. But assuming, just for the sake of argument, the possibility of robots thinking at all, the religious possibility here is contingent. By contingent, I mean that AI is not designed as constitutionally religious. It is not designed so that its thumping electronic heart, I speak poetically, or its chattering electronic brain are related to the living God. Nor could it be so devised. How could any programmer know how to do that? Humankind is religiously programmed. Its basic constitution is religious, in the image of God. If some entity has only the constitutional possibility of turning to religion or entering into a religious relationship, it is simply not human or close to being human. So an AI whose intelligence is not constitutionally religious is an entirely different kind of intelligence from human intelligence. If it thinks, it is not wired to think in the way humankind is wired to think. The mechanism of the human brain being designed so that it can receive and respond to a word from God. Now, many in the world of AI will be entirely unperturbed by this and say that they are not trying to achieve an intelligence which replicates or simulates human intelligence or produce machines that think as humans think. Many will say that. So be it. In that case, all I'm doing is radicalizing the difference between human and machine thought. Radicalizing the difference takes us to the question of comparison, superior and inferior. It may be held that human-machine comparison in those terms, especially if we talk of overall superiority and inferiority, is inappropriate and irrelevant. Perhaps it is appropriate when non-human animals are in question, but not when humans and machines are compared. Again, so be it. Let us drop comparative language and simply stick with differences. However, let us at the same time be vigilant. In some iterations of AI, for example, those which move in the direction of transhumanism, the language of superiority does feature. Transhumanism is the philosophy which advocates the technological enhancement of human capacities. It is sometimes called humanity plus. As we take the evolution of our species into our own hands and go beyond Homo sapiens sapiens. The resulting post-human being is radically superior to us in intelligence, ability, and thought. It is in a different class. But when Christians talk about the highest, they talk about being made in the image of God. When they indicate the exemplar of humanity, they indicate a man who suffered under Pontius Pilate. When they aspire to live the life to which humans are called, they speak of self-denial, taking up the cross, and washing others' feet. They may not opt to use the language of superiority more than they use the language of programming, but if they're forced to use it, they will say that for body or soul or spirit or mind or brain or heart to be programmed for discipleship to Jesus Christ through the love of God and neighbor is to be programmed for the highest which human or non-human or post-human being can achieve. Please allow me to omit discussion of angels. Now, if you were in this room with me as I lecture, I might sense your exasperation. In fact, I'm getting that remote sense. For apparently, I'm not dismissing the possibility of machines thinking as such, but I've just skated over the question. So, is that possibility of machines thinking really on the theological table? Let us ask, to what should we be committed as Christians? What are our theological commitments in this matter? As far as I can see, there are no prima facie theological commitments one way or another. Christianity directly commits me to some beliefs, but belief in the possibility or impossibility of thinking machines is not one of them. But that is not to say that scientists and philosophers, Christian scientists and Christian philosophers, might not have something definite to say about it. There's a parallel here with other scientific questions. For example, Christianity as such does not commit us to or against the view that the earth moves around the sun or that humans are evolved. But our science may commit us to or against these views. On scientific or on philosophical grounds, the possibility of thinking machines might be ruled out or in. And scientists and philosophers, especially Christian scientists and philosophers, will illuminate aspects of Christianity for those of us who are professionally neither scientists or philosophers. And so they will help shape Christian thought. But it is from that direction, not from a theological one, that light will come, if at all, on the possibility of thinking machines. I doubt if Christianity generates a principle out of its inner theological resources which guides us one way or another. I realize I'm asserting rather than arguing here. Pursuing an argument would entail thinking through the relation of the concept of thinking to other notions, such as feeling or consciousness, for example. But I doubt if Christianity will instruct us there either. With respect to machine consciousness, my theological agnosticism chimes with that of a leading neuroscientist, an influential Christian thinker of an earlier generation, Donald Mackay. Sorry, I don't have a great picture of him here. One-time research professor of communication and neuroscience at the University of Kiel, though I'm not committed to his ideas beyond this point. However, theology does have something to say here. The processes of thought in a being not made in the image of God may exhibit mechanical similarities with processes of thought in beings not so made. Here, a comparative study of humans and non-human animals is relevant. But if the human brain is wired to receive and reciprocate communication from and to God, then the thinking of a created non-human entity, if it happens at all, will be of a very different kind from the human. I say this well aware, of course, of the claim that brains do not think in any case. It is persons who think, perhaps so, but this is surely a scientific or philosophical and not a theological proposition, an immensely significant one, but beyond my remit to explore. My theologically non-committal attitude is open to at least 3 objections, and here I'm beginning to wind up. Firstly, what are the objections which Alan Turing stated? Is it theologically possible that it is the soul that thinks, that machines cannot think because they have no soul, and that Turing's response fails? Well, I think Turing's response does fail. Divine omnipotence is a subtler, far more nuanced matter than he assumed, to say the least. And he seems to think of the soul in Christian thought as a kind of substance which can be slapped onto any entity as God pleases, such as an elephant. But again, it would take me beyond my remit to discuss omnipotence and creation, and it's not necessary because it would be theologically very demanding to show that we should regard the human soul as the organ of human thought. This is partly because of what I said earlier, querying the existence of the soul as a disembodied entity. But it is also partly because even if the soul turned out to be a disembodied entity, that would not of itself demonstrate that it was the organ of human thought. Even if persons are capable of disembodied existence in some interim state between death and resurrection, and we speak of them just like that, as persons, not as souls, that would surely not tell us much about how human thought is carried on in this world. To say the least, it is theologically unsafe to eliminate the possibility of thinking machines by appealing to the role of the soul in thinking. Second objection to my theological agnosticism. Suppose we turn an alternative and opposite direction, to the body, not to the soul. Does Christianity not understand humans to be essentially embodied in a biological way different from machines? And does not Christianity regard the very possibility of thinking as depending on our possessing bodies of flesh and blood in this life and resurrected bodies in the next? But again, I doubt if we can arrive at definite conclusions about the possibility of machine thought by exploring the Christian understanding of the body. Of course, to be human in this life is, by theological definition, to be embodied. And although the Apostle Paul strongly emphasizes the discontinuity between our future resurrected bodies and our present ones of flesh and blood, life on the new earth is apparently not disembodied life. Scientifically or philosophically, again, we may say it is impossible to simulate or replicate the operations of the human brain, in the case where AI is attempting to do that, which is not always, under silicon rather than carbon conditions. But that is precisely a scientific or philosophical point. For myself, I do not see the Christian faith as such can be prescriptive in the matter. So yet again, we may conclude for theological reasons that machine thinking amounts to something fundamentally different from human thinking, but I do not see how we can rule out machine thinking as such on theological grounds to do with embodiment. Now, of course, what embodiment or disembodiment actually means where AI is concerned is a question in itself. And really, to discuss it further, quantum computers would have to be hauled into the discussion, with the accompanying talk, you may have heard it, of quintelligence. Now, I could say that this too is beyond my remit. It's not at all beyond my remit. It's just beyond my comprehension. Thirdly and finally, we might ask whether Christians are not bound to take some position as Christians on the possibility of robotic thinking, which entails robotic consciousness, because of the current discussion of robot rights. For example, if it is even possible that robots could be sentient as well as thoughtful creatures, should they not have certain legal rights, such as the right not to be harmed? Must we not, as Christians, have something to say about this? Now, this debate does not belong in science fiction. In 2007, it was announced that South Korea was working on a robot ethics charter. The European Parliament has raised the question of whether robots should be classed as electronic persons. And at around the time when I think it first did so, in 2017, Saudi Arabia granted legal citizenship to a robot. I gather, by the way, recently in the news that she, called Sophia, is now talking about having a robot baby. Lawyers are working on these things right now. So do not Christians, as a matter of urgent practical necessity, need to decide on the possibility of thinking machines? Well, perhaps they do, but again, is it directly a task for theology? It certainly is indirectly, that is, theology needs to take on board what may be scientifically known, philosophically argued, legally proposed, etc. As Christians, we might join those who agree that pain should not usually be caused to any being which can experience pain, and that there should usually be legal safeguards against that. But can it be right to say that theologically we need to take a definite position on the question of whether AI can think or be conscious, just in order for us to come up with a position on whether there should be robot rights? An accumulation of insights from different areas or disciplines, including Christian ethics, with this discussion of rights, might indeed lead us to a theological conclusion on thinking machines. But I am not yet convinced that we can move to that conclusion directly from theological premises. By theology, I always mean, by the way, what Christians should believe. A theologian for me is a Christian who has time to think through what it is that Christianity holds. The advantage of adverting to the question about robot rights is that it shows that our exercise in asking the question whether machines can think is not an exercise in shadow boxing. It is of practical importance. Speaking generally, AI marks out yet another sphere which advertises our collective social uncertainty, at least in developed countries, about what it is to be human. Some of the most pressing questions forced on us by AI, for instance, the question of surveillance, are independent of the question of whether or not a machine can think. The question of whether or not machines can think can be a speculative distraction from the range of social and cultural issues which AI raises. I grant that. But the question of robot rights is just one indication that our question is not an abstraction, even if some of us will take it as evidence that we have now reached the social point where we no longer know or feel what is real. We may, of course, conclude that for other reasons. By now, we are familiar with the observation that we are living in a post-truth society. Perhaps much of our talk surrounding AI shows that we are also living in a post-reality society. The advent of megaverse technology, which will enable us to hook up to or access and indwell virtual realities with accelerated ease, may just compound that feeling. From what I've read, it could be just as simple as this slide. I conclude. If we are to understand what goes into the possibility of thinking machines, there is a confluence of streams to be taken into account. There is the age-old fascination with the artificial animation of the inanimate. There is the pre-Christian philosophical tradition which favors rationality as the mark of humanity. There is the scientific revolution of the 17th century which drove European thought to consider the possibility that humans are machines. Thinking machines already exist, us. There is the Darwinian or neo-Darwinian outlook that generated a new sense of what it is to be human. There is the technological urge to all-round improvement, at least of those of us in socially and economically privileged situations. There is the arrogation to ourselves of the right, even responsibility, to change our bodies or to construct intelligences. A Christian response to the question of thinking machines has to take all this into account and chart all these waters. I have not even dipped my toe in them. Scientists have long asserted, as a matter of the most fundamental professional principle, that the work of science must proceed untrammeled by unscientific considerations, under no constraint by religious beliefs, excuse me, under no constraint by religious beliefs, for example. This is an assertion that has to be dissected, itself a scientific exercise, for us to understand its ramifications and consider it from all angles. But there's probably no need for Christians to quarrel with the spirit or the instinct which informs this conviction of scientific independence when that spirit or instinct is properly refined. However, Christians in science can also make the scientifically unimpeachable observation that anything we know or believe with good reason in any sphere must affect what we believe or think we know about anything else. And if Christians have reason to be Christians, it would be unreasonable for their Christianity not to affect their science at all, just as it would be unreasonable for Christians not to let science affect their Christianity at all. Christians in science are surely free to explore the possibility that machines are able to think, but they are also bound to hold that any thinking which is not ultimately unto God is infinitely less grand and glorious than the thinking to which humankind is summoned in unity with Jesus Christ in his church. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was a very, very interesting lecture. And I think that for me personally, there was a lot of food for thinking about this, so I'll have to listen to it again. But I don't see any questions appearing in the from Facebook or from YouTube, but of course people are still welcome to answer any questions. In the meantime, I scribbled down a few questions, so I'm going to ask them. You were saying earlier in your talk that you were talking about artificial intelligence. It's often defined in terms of rational agency. And I think maybe in an area that you haven't so much covered in this particular lecture, one of the things that I would consider to be an important part of my humanity from a Christian, but also from a non-Christian perspective, is my ability to appreciate beauty, in particular music or art, my ability to feel emotions. And I'm sure that this is being considered in artificial intelligence, but can you comment on that in that area?
Yes, thank you, Peter. One thing that has struck me as an outsider in terms of the technical matters in computer science and AI, one thing that struck me is the vast range of views. So there are many people writing as AI practitioners, if I call them that, who will say, of course, there is no such capacity that machines have. They don't have it now. That is the capacity to feel emotions or aesthetic capacities. They may have it later, but some say they will never have it in their nature. So there's simply a vast range there. Of course, in relation to aesthetic appreciation, it's interesting, this talk of AI music, as you know, the music produced by AI, but then the point is sometimes made that although AI can produce remarkable music, and some people cannot distinguish it from music of good composers, some people can't, that nevertheless AI itself has no appreciation of that. Now, I'm not a scientist, some familiarity with philosophy, but I'm not a professional philosopher. My own conviction is, from what I understand of science and philosophy, that it's impossible to ascribe emotion or aesthetic appreciation, capacity for aesthetic appreciation to machines. But there is a range of views on that. And partly I think that's because if you forget AI, there is a range of views on what constitutes emotion, for example.
Okay, thank you. I see a couple of questions emerging in our chat. So the first question that I see here: is it plausible for the nefesh to be conceived in Aristotelian terms as an efficient cause with purpose or telos, and hence as an algorithm?
Thank you. I look forward to whoever asked that question answering it. Let me explain for those who may not be familiar. Nefesh is the Hebrew word often translated soul. Now, is it possible to think of it in Aristotelian terms, in terms of causality? I think that if you stick to the biblical language of soul, by which I mean the nefesh in the Hebrew and suche in the Greek, I don't think it's easy to fit that into a scheme of causality, fourfold causality, or any other kind of causality. I think our problem here is partly linguistic, in that it depends a little on what language you're debating these ideas in. But broadly speaking, I think that what happens with Descartes, certainly, and even arguably with Aquinas before that, who stood in the Aristotelian tradition, and one might explore this, even with Aquinas, I think there is a kind of departure from strict biblical usage. Now, you might say, but theology or philosophical theology is not bound to strict biblical usage. It should be free to deploy terminology like soul in its own theological or philosophical fashion. That may be true. So the question then has to be answered by saying, can it be used in this causal scheme? Well, it depends. It depends on whether you are devising your scheme with an Aristotelian background, for example, or a Thomist application of that background. Thomist, by the way, means Thomas Aquinas. The questioner will know this, but others won't. Or are you using it in a biblical sense? This is a perennial problem, I think, with discussion across sometimes different languages. You might ask a question about the distinction between spirit and mind, but in German, Geist, for example, can translate either. Descartes himself, who talks of soul, sometimes uses it interchangeably with mind. In fact, he usually does, but the times when he doesn't. And then you have to ask what's happening in the Latin, what's happening in the French for Descartes. I'm sorry if that seems an evasive answer. It just seems to me that it depends what conceptual scheme you're already operating with. And if it's a biblical conceptual scheme, which is my preference if possible, then I doubt if it can be used in the fashion that the questioner has suggested.
Okay, thank you. There are a few more questions that are popping in here. I'm going to combine two questions. And the one question here is, it seems that the next question would be whether artificial intelligence can communicate. And then there's a following question where it's being asked, is there an issue to be addressed regarding the absence of free will from any constructed machine? So can artificial intelligence communicate, and does it kind of display the presence of free will?
I think that with communication, we are again, although perhaps less dramatically than in the case of thinking and intelligence, we are looking at different ways of using the word communication. Does one mean by communication an intentional communication, the attempt to communicate knowingly? Now, if you're asking whether AI can knowingly attempt to communicate, my impression is, I'm not an expert, but my impression is that those scientists and philosophers, including AI people, who say, no, of course, it can't knowingly do that, my impression is that they're correct. On the other hand, it's also the case, of course, that artificial intelligence is not simply individuated. I mean, there are communications between artificial intelligences, I'll put it in that crude, popular way at the moment. So again, it depends, I suppose, what you mean exactly by communication. Free will. Now, it will not usually trouble people in AI. I think this is a fair generalization. I've got to be careful. It will not usually trouble people in AI if AI does not have free will, because the way of thinking about humans in any case, forgetting AI, is often in the third millennium and has been for some time, that humans don't have free will in any case. So this again is part of a wider debate. Should we say, if we should say artificial intelligence does not have free will, for many people, that would mean, well, there's no problem there. It doesn't entail that they're not like humans, because humans don't have free will either. The brain is something which is determined by physical laws and its operation and so forth. So I suppose one have to say artificial intelligence does not have free will, but whether that's a problem, if you're trying to create some sort of similarity between artificial and human intelligence, whether it's a problem depends on your view of what it is to be human.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to another question here. Do you have any thoughts on potential differences machine beings might have when it comes to religious practice or expression? And if different, how practically might we worship alongside them? I think that you've kind of implicitly already answered that question in your whole perspective on artificial intelligence, but maybe you can provide us with a brief comment.
When the questioner asks, sorry to address the questioner in that rather detached way, when the question asks about potential differences machine beings might have, I presume you mean differences between machines and humans in their religious practice or expression. Yes, I think, Peter, you're right. I think I've implicitly answered that. Religion is not some sort of external or ritual matter. It's not a set of practices. It's not a prayer. Religion, true religion, the religion which we believe has been constituted for humankind by the Creator, is a personal relationship, whereby as a human I'm related to God, but as the particular human I am, Stephen Williams, as opposed to Peter, for example, I have my particular relationship to God. And that is only possible because I'm set up as a human being religiously. And therefore, a machine, if it's not, as it were, set up, if it's not devised religiously, as it were, it's not essentially religious, then no, it might have external practices and expressions, but it doesn't have a true inward relationship to its creator, which is what religion is essentially about. How might we worship alongside them? Personally, I wouldn't try.
Okay, yes, so there's another comment here. Just a comment about body parts and the literal versus figurative use. We talk about gut feeling to refer to feelings in the brain and also a way of making decisions. And we have learned that there are many more gut, bowel, and brain connections than usually thought. So in my mind, that's the question. The specific body part word used is not very important. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, my wife Susan, who is probably listening in at this moment, informs me, she knows more than I do about the brain, she informs me that we are learning now about connections between brain and, for example, heart, which we didn't know before. We are learning about those things. It's very interesting in terms of biblical anthropology, because the heart, we may find the heart thinks all the same. Now, let me just get this question right. Comment about body parts and the literal versus figurative use. We talk about gut feelings, refer to feelings in the brain, also a way of making decisions. Yes. I think that there are different ways of using language. Forgetting for a moment biblical language, I hope I've said something useful about that. But we do in everyday discourse use language in different ways. We use it sometimes with scientific precision. We use it sometimes to express how we feel, whether or not it is scientifically precise. So when I talk about a gut feeling, well, I may be talking literally about how I experience things, but a scientist may come along and say to me, did you realize that what you thought was gut feeling actually works rather differently? What I've got to keep is, I think, what I've got to keep hold of is the experience, the reality, the experience of gut feeling. And this is something which I found something scientists can set aside too easily. They talk as though the real thing is the scientific account of something. And that therefore our feelings are expressed rather loosely. But actually, a description of our feelings are thoroughly first-person, real descriptions. That is, they describe realities. They don't always describe them in scientifically precise ways. So I think we can use both languages, as we do with the rising sun. You and I will talk about the sun rising, and no one should object to that, even though we might say, of course, scientifically, we don't believe the sun goes around the earth.
I actually, just as a comment, there's, I think, a bit of a physiological perspective behind this, because I think a lot of people who are suffering from minor digestive problems, that might feed into, in a sense, their brain function, because they feel anxious as a result of this. It's purely physiological things. I think it's the brain-gut axis that it's sometimes referred to.
Yes, thank you.
I don't see any further comments yet, but I'm going to ask another question, if I may. You haven't talked about science fiction movies, and I think I can't really specify the details in the movies all that much, but I think there are quite a lot of science fiction movies around that, in one form or another, are dealing with the issue of thinking machines and the perceived ethical issues surrounding that. I mean, one example of a movie that I can think of is Chappie, and that is a robot who, and the whole issue of good and evil, it comes to bear on the way the robot behaves. But there's also, of course, the well-known robot character Data in Star Trek, who frequently muses about his own nature. I don't know whether you would have any comments on those sci-fi movies, even although you didn't cover them in your lecture.
No, you're right. And I confess I've got a lot of catching up to do with sci-fi movies, which I would enjoy watching, and I have missed out on some of the important ones. In that book, by the way, you mentioned earlier, Peter, in introducing me, John Wyatt and myself, the one we edited, The Robot Will See You Now, we have a chapter there on AI in science fiction and film. So I can't comment on those particular movies, but I can say, I think, two things. One is, I have spoken on AI in more than one audience, where people can be very frustrated that you're trying to, with the word AI, you're trying to cover computer science, of which AI is a subfield or discipline. I don't quite know which is the better word. And you're trying to cover science fiction. Those are totally different things. So I sympathize with that difficulty we have to distinguish between the two kinds of things, although there are lots of things between them too. The second thing I'd say is this. One thing that's very interesting about science fiction here, in the context of AI, is that some scientific research seems to have been driven by science fiction. Now, into scientific research, of course, in the 20th century, a lot of things went. But science fiction helped the research along. And, you have a figure like, I'm sorry, I'm not talking about a film here, but a figure like Isaac Asimov, whose work I've read a little bit of. Asimov said things about robots which scientists said, well, let's take these things seriously and let's look into the possibilities. So I'm told. Sorry not to be able to answer that.
No, but that's an interesting perspective, and maybe a motivation for some to take a look at your book. I don't see any further questions appearing in the chat, and I don't have any further questions to ask. So I'm going to end this lecture, we want to give you a very, very big thank you for delivering a very inspiring and relevant lecture on a very important topic. And we want to thank all of you who have joined this live stream, who've asked questions, and we also want to thank those who will listen to this lecture at a future date. I also want to thank Dr. Gareth Dalzell, who has been on standby in case of internet problems, and especially a thank you to Steph Bevan in Cardiff. Steph is the Development Officer of Christians in Science, and she has controlled the live stream to YouTube that you have been watching. So goodbye and God bless, and we hope that we can see you at one of the future Walton lectures.